A poor girl's simple act of kindness on a dark street uncovers a hidden truth that changes both their lives forever. She saved a beaten billionaire, never imagining he was the father she'd been searching for all along. Aliyah had never known a life of comfort. From the time she was a small child, the world around her seemed cold and full of struggle. A place where broken sidewalks and empty buildings told silent stories of dreams that had died too early. Her home was a tiny two-room apartment inside an old, crumbling building with peeling paint and leaking pipes. The building smelled of dust, mold, and old cooking oil. Most nights, the heat barely worked in winter, and during the summer, the fan in their window barely moved the thick, hot air. Aliyah lived with her grandmother, whom she called Nana. Nana was in her 70s and suffered from arthritis, diabetes, and constant back pain. Her legs didn't work well anymore, so she spent most of her time in a worn-out recliner in the living room. The two of them shared that small apartment, just the two of them, since the day Aliyah was born. Her mother had passed away giving birth. To her and her father was just a name no one ever spoke of. Every time Aliyah had asked about him growing up, grandmother's eyes would grow quiet and heavy, and she'd say, "That man doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're here." Even though Aliyah had never seen a picture of him, never heard his voice, never got a single birthday card from him, something deep inside her always longed to know who he was. But life was too hard to spend time thinking about dreams. Every day brought new problems. There were bills to pay, food to buy, medicine to get for Nana, and sometimes it felt like the whole world was pressing down on her small shoulders. Aliyah was only 17. She worked harder than most adults. After school, she rushed straight to her first job at a local diner, washing dishes and cleaning tables. When that shift ended, she ran across 2 blocks to the corner store, where she helped restock shelves. On weekends, she sometimes babysat for neighbors or helped clean houses. Whatever money she earned, she handed to Nana without question. They used it for rent, groceries, and the medicine Nana needed to keep going. Often, there wasn't enough left for herself. Some days, Aliyah would go to bed hungry after feeding her grandmother the last piece of bread or the final spoon of soup. But even in the middle of all this, Aliyah never complained. She had a quiet strength in her, the kind that doesn't show off, but never breaks. Her classmates often teased her for her worn-out shoes or her hand-me-down clothes. But she walked with her head high, her eyes full of quiet fire. She loved to read when she had the time. Old library books were her escape stories about nurses and doctors and people who saved lives. More than anything, Aliyah wanted to become a nurse. She had no idea how she'd afford college, but the dream burned bright inside her heart. At school, Aliyah was known as the girl who always helped others. If a classmate forgot lunch, she would offer her only sandwich. If someone cried in the hallway, she would sit beside them until they felt better. Her teachers noticed this about her. One of them, Miss Carter, often said, "Aliyah, you have the kind of soul this world needs more of." But compliments didn't feed you or pay rent. Aliyah knew that too well. Sometimes at night, after her grandmother had fallen asleep, Aliyah would sit by the window and look at the stars. She wondered if her mother was watching from somewhere, far above. She whispered little prayers for strength, for Nana's health, for just one day where she wouldn't have to worry about money. And sometimes when the city was quiet and the moonlight poured through the dusty glass, she would whisper, "I wish I could know who he was, just once." There were days when everything felt too heavy. One day the electricity was cut off for 2 whole nights because they couldn't pay the bill. Another day her grandmother collapsed in the kitchen and had to be taken to the hospital. Aliyah missed work that night and lost a shift. The boss yelled at her, telling her he couldn't afford unreliable kids. But Aliyah didn't yell back. She just nodded quietly and left. Her eyes were tired, but her heart kept going. In all of this hardship, what kept Aliyah going was love. The deep love she felt for her grandmother. The way Nana smiled when Aliyah brushed her hair in the mornings. The way she always said, "You're my little soldier," every time Aliyah helped her with her medicine. And sometimes, when they had a little bit of extra change, they would walk together to the corner and buy a small ice cream cone to share. Those small moments felt like treasure. Aliyah's life was not a movie or a storybook. There were no big miracles, no sudden changes of fate. It's just hard days followed by harder ones. But inside her was something rarer, heart full of kindness that had survived pain, rejection, and poverty without turning cold. That was what made her different. Was what made her strong. One evening, after working a double shift, Aliyah was walking home as usual. The streets were nearly empty, and the sky had turned a soft orange as the sun dipped behind the buildings. She held a brown paper bag with a few groceries in one hand and her backpack in the other. Her feet ached and her shoulders hurt, but she kept walking as she turned into a narrow alley that cut through to her block. She heard something strange, a soft groaning sound. At first she stopped. Could have been anything: a drunk, a dog, maybe even something dangerous. In her neighborhood, people learned not to get involved. You mind your business, you walk on, you stay safe. But something inside Aliyah made her step forward. Carefully, she followed the sound until she saw a man lying on the ground beside a dumpster. He was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. His face was bruised, his shirt torn, and there was blood on his forehead. A torn leather briefcase lay beside him, papers scattered around. His eyes were half open, and he groaned again, trying to sit up but failing. Aliyah dropped her bag and rushed to him. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said, kneeling beside him. He barely nodded. She checked his pulse, then his breathing. He was alive, but weak. She pulled out her phone and called for help, but the dispatcher told her it might take time. Resources were limited. It wasn't an emergency priority. She couldn't just leave him there, so she gently helped him sit up, supporting his weight as best she could. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe," she whispered. With all her strength, she helped him stand, one arm around her shoulder, the other holding his waist. He was taller than her, heavier too, but she didn't care. Step by step, they moved out of the alley. She half-carried, half-walked him 3 blocks to a local church shelter. The pastor there knew Aliyah and trusted her. They helped her get the man onto a cot and gave him water. She used her own money to buy bandages and ointment from the nearby pharmacy and cleaned his wounds herself. The man didn't say much. He kept his eyes on her, quietly watching as she worked. Something about the way she moved, the way she cared. Without asking anything in return, it touched something deep in him, something buried long ago. That night, Aliyah stayed at the shelter to watch over him. She didn't even think about her job or the walk home. All that mattered was that he was okay. She sat beside him as he rested, gently adjusting the blanket over him when he shivered. He finally spoke around midnight, his voice raspy. "Why? Did you help me?" Aliyah looked at him with tired but honest eyes. "Because you needed help. That's enough." He closed his eyes and nodded, but a tear escaped down the side of his face. He didn't say more. But in that moment, something had changed, something Aliyah didn't even realize yet. What she didn't know was that the man she had saved was not just any stranger. He was one of the richest men in the country. A billionaire who had once walked away from a woman he loved and a child he never met. A man who had lived with guilt for decades. And now, here he was, beaten, broken, and helpless, being saved by the very person he had once abandoned. Without either of them knowing the truth, Aliyah had no idea what was coming next. She had no idea that the man lying in that cot was her father, that the kindness she had given to a stranger would soon change everything she had ever known. Charles Hunt had lived a life most people only dreamed of. He wore suits that cost more than some people's monthly rent and lived in a house so large that you could get lost just walking through the hallways. He owned luxury cars, private jets, and had his name on office towers and magazines. People looked up to him as a genius, a business legend, a self-made billionaire. But beneath all the money and power, there was a man with secrets. And one secret in particular had haunted him for over 17 years. He rarely talked about his past, even to those closest to him. Most people knew him only as the powerful CEO of a massive tech company, Hunt Global Technologies. They didn't know that before the money, before the success, Charles had once been just a poor boy from a small town in Georgia. He had dreams like anyone else, but he also had fear. And that fear had once made him walk away from the only girl he'd ever truly loved. Her name was Rachel. She had been beautiful, bold, and full of light. They had met in college when Charles was still a struggling computer science student, and Rachel was studying to be a nurse. They were complete opposites. He was quiet and careful, while she was joyful and full of hope. But somehow, they fit perfectly. For 2 years, they were inseparable. They had big plans for the future, talked about building a life together, maybe, even starting a family. But everything changed during their final year when Rachel told him she was pregnant. Charles had frozen. Fear gripped him in a way he couldn't explain. He wasn't ready. He didn't have money, a stable job, or any idea how to take care of a child. Instead of staying and fighting through it, he made the worst mistake of his life. He left.
What?
Morning, without a word, he packed his bags and disappeared from Rachel's life. He changed cities, started a new life, and buried that chapter deep in his memory. Over the years, guilt gnawed at him, but he always told himself it was too late to go back. He didn't even know if Rachel had kept the baby. Part of him hoped she hadn't, but deep down, another part of him hoped she had, that the child his. Child had grown up strong without needing him. Years passed. Charles became rich, powerful, and respected. His name was on the cover of Forbes, and he was invited to the White House for tech summits. But the more he achieved, the lonelier he became. He had no wife, no children, no family. His success had cost him everything personal. And no matter how many awards he received or how high his bank account rose, that empty space inside never went away. He tried to fill it with work, investments, charities, and expensive toys, but none of it helped. The guilt remained like a shadow that followed him everywhere. He often thought of Rachel, wondered what had become of her. Did she get married? Was she happy? Was she even alive? And what about the child? Was it a boy or a girl? Did they ever ask about their father? One day, his assistant told him about a small charity event in Chicago, an organization that provided education and shelter to kids living in poverty. Something about the cause touched Charles. Maybe it reminded him of his own childhood, or maybe it was just the need to do something good for once. He decided to go, but quietly. No press, no interviews. He wanted to do it in secret. He filled a leather suitcase with a large amount of donation cash, the kind of money that could change the lives of many struggling families. He booked a private trip to Chicago under a false name, planning to attend the event quietly and hand over the money without anyone knowing who he was. The night before the event, Charles arrived in the city. It was cold and windy, typical for Chicago. He dressed in a plain coat and hat to avoid attention, and walked the streets near the shelter. Where the charity event would be held the next day, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. He was surprised by how rundown the area was. Trash littered the sidewalks, and many buildings had broken windows and graffiti. People walked with their heads down, hands in their pockets, avoiding eye contact. It was a part of the city the world forgot. As he crossed a narrow alley, something unexpected happened. 2 men suddenly jumped out from behind a dumpster. One of them was tall and muscular, the other smaller but quicker. Before Charles could react, they grabbed him and demanded the suitcase. He tried to hold on to it, telling them it was for charity. Not for himself, but they didn't care. They punched him hard in the face, causing him to stumble backward. The taller man kicked him in the ribs, while the other ripped the case from his hands. Charles tried to fight back, but he was no match. For them, they hit him again, knocking him to the ground. His vision blurred and pain shot through his entire body. As he lay bleeding on the cold pavement, he heard them running away with the suitcase. The sound of their footsteps faded, and he was left alone, half-conscious, bleeding, and aching in the alley. He tried to move but couldn't. His body refused. The cold air stung his face, and everything around him went silent. In that moment, he thought he might die. His life didn't flash before his eyes like in the movies, but a face did come to mind. Rachel's. And then, strangely, the image of a little girl he had never seen before. A child with brown skin and bright eyes. He didn't know if she was real or just a creation of his regret, but the image felt powerful. If I survive this, he thought, Maybe I'll finally do the right thing. But he didn't get up. He didn't call for help. Couldn't. All he could do was lie there, broken and helpless, in the very kind of place he'd spent his life trying to forget. The man who had millions in the bank now had nothing, not even strength in his legs. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that help was coming. Not from the police, not from a doctor, not even from the charity workers he had planned to meet. No help was coming from someone else's stranger, a girl who had no reason to care, a girl who didn't know his name or his story, a girl who had every reason to walk away. That girl was Aliyah. He didn't know her. He had never seen her before. But when she found him bleeding in that alley, she didn't run or hesitate. She didn't ask who he was or what he had done. She just acted. She lifted his head gently, whispered to him that he would be okay, and helped him up. He could barely speak, but he remembered her face, the determination in her eyes, the kindness in her touch. He remembered thinking, who is this girl? He had spent years surrounded by powerful men and women politicians, tech giants, CEOs, had shaken hands with presidents, and walked red carpets. But no one had ever looked at him the way Aliyah did, not with fear, not with greed, but with pure, simple human concern. She didn't know he was rich. She didn't care. To her, he was just a man who needed help. When she brought him to the shelter, he felt a strange sense of peace. Even though his body ached and his mind was foggy, there was something calming about her presence. She spoke softly, moved carefully, and never once asked for anything. She even used her own money to buy medicine for him. That touched him more deeply than he could explain. Lying on that cot in the shelter, staring at the cracked ceiling, Charles couldn't stop thinking about her. He tried to speak, but the pain in his ribs and jaw made it difficult. Still, he managed a few words. Why? Did you help me? My answer was simple. Because you needed help. That's enough. And just like that, something inside him cracked out. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as Charles Hunt the billionaire, not as a man who abandoned his past, just as a human being in pain. He watched her as she sat beside him, brushing her curls away from her eyes, checking on him every few minutes. There was something about her that felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. Maybe it was her voice, or maybe her eyes, or maybe it was something deeper, something his soul recognized, even if his mind hadn't yet caught up as the night went on. He drifted in and out of sleep, but his thoughts stayed fixed on her. Who was she? Why did she remind him of Rachel? In the quiet darkness of the shelter, as the world outside remained cold and distant, Charles made a silent promise. If he survived this, if he healed, he would find out who she was. He would do something for her, something real. And maybe, just maybe, he would finally try to face the past he had spent so long running from. He had no idea yet that the girl who had saved him was more than just a kind stranger. She was his daughter. The cold night outside had faded into early morning when Aliyah woke up in the wooden chair beside the cot. Her back hurt and her legs felt stiff, but she didn't complain. She blinked slowly, stretched her arms, and looked over at the man she had saved. He was still asleep, breathing deeply, his body wrapped in the thick blanket the shelter had provided. The bruises on his face looked worse now, darker and swollen. He looked like someone who had been through more than just one bad night. He looked like someone carrying a lifetime of pain. Aliyah stood up and gently adjusted the blanket over him. He didn't move, just sighed softly in his sleep. She picked up the empty water bottle beside his bed and went to refill it from the sink. She had been up half the night checking on him, making sure his bandages didn't come loose, watching his chest rise and fall. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe it was because he reminded her of the men she saw in the neighborhood who had fallen on hard times, men who once had dreams. But the world had been too cruel. Or maybe it was because of the sadness in his eyes when he briefly opened them and asked why she had helped him. It had been the first thing he'd said. Because you needed help. That's enough. She had answered from the heart. She didn't think he'd remember it, but somehow she hoped he did. She didn't even know his name. He hadn't told her anything. No ID, no phone, no wallet, just a torn-up coat, a bruised face, and a briefcase full of crumpled papers and broken dreams. The briefcase was still sitting near the bed, slightly open. Laya hadn't looked inside, not out of fear but out of respect. If he wanted her to know something, he would tell her. Later that morning, the shelter's nurse came to check on him. She cleaned the wounds again and gave him something for the pain. Aliyah watched silently as the man opened his eyes and looked around. When he saw her standing nearby, he nodded slowly, then spoke with effort. "You stayed?" Aliyah gave a small smile. "Yeah, you needed someone." He studied her for a moment. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice hoarse but full of sincerity. Aliyah shrugged. "It's okay. You don't have to thank me." But the man didn't just feel thankful. He felt confused. He had been rich for most of his life. He was used to people being polite, friendly, and helpful. But always with some reason behind it: money, connections, publicity. But this girl had saved him, spent her money on him, slept beside his cot in a cold shelter all, without knowing who he was, or expecting anything in return. "Do you have a name?" he asked Aliyah. She replied, "And you." He paused, then lied. "John." It wasn't that he didn't want her to know the truth. It was just too soon. His real name, Charles Hunt, came with a history, a long, messy one. A name like his made people treat you differently. You got nervous, fake, or greedy. But he didn't want that with her. Didn't know why, but with Aliyah, he wanted to stay invisible. Just a man recovering from a bad night. Aliyah sat on the chair again. "Well, John, I'm glad you're awake. You scared me last night." He looked at her with tired eyes. "I scare myself sometimes." They shared a small smile, then silence. As the hours passed, the shelter offered Charles more help. A doctor came to check on him, and a social worker asked questions which he avoided answering. Aliyah stayed for most of the day, only leaving for a short while to check on her grandmother and bring her some food. Nana was worried about her being out all night, but when Aliyah explained what had happened, her grandmother just nodded and whispered, "That's just who you are, baby. You always help others." When Aliyah returned to the shelter that evening, Charles looked better. The swelling on his face had gone down, and he had eaten some soup. His eyes followed her as she walked in, and for a brief second, something flickered. In them recognition? Or something deeper? "Back again," he said. "I promised I'd check on you. I must look terrible." Aliyah tilted her head. "You look like someone who's been through something, but that's nothing to be ashamed of." He smiled softly. "You're kind." "No," she said. Shaking her head, "I just believe that what you give to the world comes back to you somehow, even if it takes time." Charles felt something shift inside him. The way she spoke, the way her words felt real and grounded, it reminded him of someone, and not just anyone. Rachel, the woman he had once loved and walked away from. Aliyah didn't look exactly like her, but there were pieces: her warmth, her fire, her calm strength. For the first time since he'd met Aliyah, the thought hit him like lightning. Could this girl be connected to his past? That night, after Aliyah left, Charles asked the shelter staff for a computer. He told them he needed to check emails, but the truth was different. He began searching quietly: her name, her school, her social media, whatever he could find. And what he discovered shocked him. Her mother's name had been Rachel Morgan, the same Rachel he had known years ago. He felt his heart race. He kept digging. Rachel had passed away 17 years ago, shortly after giving birth. There was no record of a father on the birth certificate. Only a baby girl named Aliyah Morgan. Charles sat frozen for several minutes, staring at the screen. His hands trembled. He felt dizzy, like the ground beneath him was moving. Everything inside him screamed with disbelief, fear, guilt, and something else: hope. Could it be true? Could the girl who saved his life, who sat beside his bed and treated him with kindness, be his daughter? He shut the laptop slowly, his mind spinning. The timeline matched, the name matched. The place, the age, everything fit. He couldn't believe it. He had been face to face with his daughter, and neither of them knew. But now he knew, and he couldn't just ignore it. He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about Rachel, about the baby he had abandoned. What kind of man had he been? How had the universe brought them back together in such a strange way? The next morning, Aliyah arrived at the shelter again. She looked tired but cheerful. "Morning, John," she greeted him. "Morning, Aliyah." Stared at her a little longer than usual. She noticed, but didn't say anything. "I brought you some fresh fruit," she said, placing a small plastic bag on the table. "Bananas and apples. Good for healing." "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't talk much, do you?" she teased. He gave a small laugh. "I'm thinking a lot." She nodded. "That's fair. Sometimes thinking is healing too." As the day went on, Charles felt torn. He wanted to tell her everything, but he also feared what would happen. What if she didn't believe him? What if she hated him? What if she told him to leave and never come back? So instead, he chose a different path. He hired a private investigator. Quietly, through a contact, he arranged for a DNA test. He got a sample of his own from the hospital and found a way to gather a sample from Ali using a napkin she had used. It felt sneaky and wrong, but he didn't want to approach her with a lie or a guess. He needed the truth. He needed to be sure. The results came back 3 days later. Positive. She was his daughter. The moment he saw the results, sat down and wept. He had missed her entire life. Her first steps, her first words, her first day of school, her birthdays, her fears, her dreams. And yet, by some strange miracle, life had given him a second chance. She had found him, or maybe he'd been led to her. Now came the hardest part, telling her. But instead of rushing, Charles chose to move slowly. He didn't want to scare her or ruin the fragile connection they had. So he began spending more time with her. He asked questions about her life, her grandmother, her school, her dreams. He listened to her stories and laughed at her jokes. He admired her strength and felt proud in a way he had never experienced before. Every time he looked at her, he saw pieces of Rachel, pieces of himself, and something entirely her own. A light that couldn't be explained. Aliyah, for her part, was surprised by how quickly she felt comfortable with John. She found herself opening up to him in ways she didn't expect. She told him about her dream of becoming a nurse, her struggles at school, the way she sometimes cried at night because life was too heavy. And he listened not like a stranger, but like someone who truly cared. One afternoon, she said something that made his heart ache. "I wish I knew who my father was," she whispered. "I'm not angry at him. I wish I could understand why he didn't want to know me." Charles looked at her and wanted to cry. "What if he didn't know how?" he asked softly. She looked at him with wide eyes. "Maybe," she said. "I don't know. I used to imagine him as a superhero or a doctor or something, but now I think maybe he was just scared." Charles nodded slowly. Sometimes people make mistakes they can't undo. But it doesn't mean they stop caring. She didn't answer, but her eyes glistened. That night, Charles knew he couldn't hide the truth much longer. The truth was alive now, sitting between them like a secret that wanted to be free. And soon, he would have to tell her, because she deserved to know, and because no matter what happened next. She had already changed his life. He only hoped she would let him try to change hers. Charles Hunt sat in the small room at the shelter, his heart pounding faster than it ever had. For days, he had been building up courage to tell Aliyah the truth. The truth about who he really was, about their connection, and about everything he had missed. Every time he saw her, he felt a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that she would understand, and fear that she might reject him forever. Aliyah had been growing closer to him in these days. She shared stories about her life, her grandmother Nana, and her dreams of becoming a nurse. She laughed at his jokes and listened when he spoke, even though he was still recovering from the attack. They had started to form a bond that felt natural, like two lost people finding a way back to each other. But Charles knew the truth would change everything. He wasn't sure if it would break the fragile trust or strengthen it. He thought about how to start the conversation. Should he write her a letter? Should he tell her in person? Should he ask someone to help explain? None of those felt right. Aliyah deserved honesty, and she deserved to hear it from him. One afternoon, after lunch at the shelter, Charles asked her to sit down with him. She looked at him curiously but agreed. He took a deep breath and began, Aliyah, there's something very important I need to tell you. Something I've been holding inside for a long time. She listened quietly, her eyes wide but calm. I'm not the man I told you I was, he said softly. My real name is Charles Hunt. I'm the father you never knew you had. Aliyah blinked, her mouth slightly open in shock. For a moment she didn't say anything. Charles continued, telling her about Rachel, her mother, about how they met, how they fell in love, and how he had made the terrible mistake of leaving when he found out she was pregnant. He spoke of the fear he felt, the shame, and the years of regret that followed. He told her how he had tried to forget the past but never could. When he finished, silence filled the room. Leia's eyes searched his face, trying to understand. If he was telling the truth or just making a story, I don't know what to say, she finally whispered. I've always wanted to know who my father was, but I never thought it would be someone like you. Charles looked at her, feeling both hopeful and nervous. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I want to be part of your life now, if you'll let me. Aliyah sat back, her mind racing with questions and emotions. She had spent so many years wondering about this man she never met. Now here he was, broken and humble, asking to be her father. It was hard to believe. It was hard to trust. For days she stayed quiet, thinking about what he had said. Her grandmother Nana noticed her silence and gently asked what was wrong. Aliyah told her everything: the attack, the shelter, and the man named John who had saved her and now revealed he was her father. Nana held her hands and said, My dear child, sometimes life gives us second chances. You have to decide what your heart wants. But remember, forgiveness is not just for him. It's for you too. Those words stayed with Aliyah. Slowly, she realized she didn't want to carry anger or sadness forever. She wanted to know her father, to understand the man behind the name. So, she decided to give him a chance. When she returned to the shelter, she found Charles waiting nervously. She sat beside him and took his hand. I want to try, she said softly. Charles smiled, tears welling in his eyes. It was the happiest moment of his life. From that day on, they began to build their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were days filled with awkward silences, moments of doubt, and times when the past seemed too heavy to bear. But there were also days filled with laughter, stories shared, and dreams discussed. Charles introduced Aliyah to things she had never experienced before: art galleries, libraries, even a quiet dinner at a nice restaurant. Aliyah, in turn, showed Charles the world she lived in. She took him to her school, introduced him to her friends, and brought him to Nana's small apartment. She wanted him to see her life, the struggles and the joys. Slowly, Charles saw the strength and resilience that had been missing in his life. He realized how much he had missed and how much he still had to learn. One day, Charles invited Aliyah to visit his company. She was nervous, but excited. The moment they entered the tall glass building with shining floors and busy workers, Aliyah felt out of place, but curious. Charles introduced her to his employees and showed her his office. Filled with expensive furniture and the latest technology, Aliyah was amazed. She asked questions about how the company worked and how her father had built it from nothing. Told her stories about his struggles, about the sacrifices he made, and about how important it was to never give up. That day, Aliyah saw not just a billionaire, but a man who had fought his own battles. She felt proud of him, but also sad for the time they had lost. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger. Charles began to support Aliyah's dreams. He paid for her nursing classes, helped with books, and encouraged her every step of the way. He even started to learn about the neighborhood she came from, trying to understand the challenges she faced daily. Aliyah noticed the changes in him too. The man who once avoided people and hid behind money was becoming more open, more caring, more human. But even as their lives intertwined, the past still lingered. Charles wanted to find out more about Rachel, about her life after he left, and about the events that led to her early death. He felt guilty for not being there for either of them. Aliyah helped him find old photos and letters Nana had kept. Read Rachel's diary together, learning about her hopes, fears, and how much she had loved Charles, despite everything. They cried and laughed, discovering parts of Rachel that felt alive through the memories. One afternoon, Charles took Aliyah to visit Rachel's grave. It was a small, simple place in a quiet cemetery. Charles placed flowers carefully and whispered a soft apology to the woman who had changed his life forever. Aliyah stood beside him, holding his hand. "I wish she could have known you, Charles." Said quietly, "She did," Aliyah answered. "In a way, she's still with us." The visit brought a peaceful feeling neither of them had expected. It was as if a circle was finally closing, making room for a new beginning. As their relationship deepened, Charles also faced challenges from the outside world. Some business partners and friends were surprised to hear about his secret daughter. Some questioned his judgment, while others were suspicious of Aliyah's intentions. But Charles didn't care. For the first time, family mattered more than money or status. He publicly acknowledged Aliyah as his daughter and included her in his life openly. The media caught wind of the story. It became a sensation. A poor girl who saved a billionaire only to discover he was her father. The story touched many hearts and inspired people to believe in the power of forgiveness and second chances. Aliyah faced her own struggles too. Some of her friends doubted the story or teased her, but most supported her. She found strength in her new family and in herself. She worked hard at school, determined to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from the rooftop of Charles's building, Aliyah spoke softly. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Charles smiled, holding her close. "Thank you for saving me." In that moment, they both understood that life had given them a gift, a chance to rewrite their story, to heal old wounds and to build a future together. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other. And sometimes that was enough to make all the difference in the world. Life changed for Aliyah and Charles in ways neither of them could have imagined. After their heartfelt conversations and the slow, careful rebuilding of their relationship, things began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. For the first time in many years, both of them felt something that had been missing. Family Charles had stepped into a world that was completely different from the one Aliyah had known. He lived in a huge house, drove fancy cars, and had a powerful business empire. But none of that mattered as much to him as the simple moments he shared with his daughter. Watching her laugh, seeing her work hard at school, and hearing her dreams for the future made him realize that this was what truly mattered. Aliyah, on the other hand, was learning to balance her two worlds. She still visited Nana every day and helped around their small apartment. She still remembered the struggles of her old life, the nights without enough food, the cold mornings, and the feeling of being invisible. But now she also attended prestigious nursing classes, met people from different backgrounds, and experienced things she never thought possible. It was overwhelming at times, but she never forgot where she came from. Together, they faced challenges that tested their growing bond. Some people in Charles's business circle tried to interfere, questioning Aliyah's place in his life. Some old friends warned Charles to be careful, saying that money could attract people with bad intentions. Aliyah felt the weight of judgment too, as some classmates whispered behind her back and others doubted the truth of her story. But through it all, they stood strong. One afternoon, Charles and Aliyah sat in his office. The sun shone through the tall windows, casting warm light over the room filled with books and awards. Charles looked at Aliyah, proud and determined. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here for you," he said. Aliyah smiled back. "And I want to prove to you that I'm worthy of this chance." Their eyes met, and in that moment, they didn't need to say more. They understood each other perfectly. Aliyah worked hard at school. Nursing was not easy, but she found joy in learning how to care for others. She volunteered at hospitals, helped children in need, and dreamed of one day opening a clinic in her old neighborhood. She wanted to give back, to use the opportunities she now had to help others who struggled like she once did. Charles supported her every step of the way. He provided tutors when she needed extra help and arranged internships that gave her real experience. He also started a charity foundation focused on improving healthcare and education in underprivileged communities. Alia became one of the leaders of the foundation. Using her story to inspire others, their lives became a blend of past and future, struggle and success, pain and healing. Alia never forgot Nana's wise words about forgiveness and second chances. She forgave Charles for leaving not because she forgot the pain, but because she understood that people could change. Charles, too, learned many lessons. He realized that money and power were meaningless without love and connection. He learned to listen, to be patient, and to put family first. The mistakes of the past didn't disappear, but they became a foundation for growth. One important moment came when Charles took Alia to meet his closest friends and family. It was a big step for both of them. Some people were surprised but welcomed her warmly. Others needed time to adjust. Alia felt nervous but brave. She stood tall, knowing she belonged. The media also followed their story closely. Headlines talked about the poor girl who saved a billionaire and found out he was her father. Interviews and articles praised their courage and honesty. Alia used this attention to speak about poverty, homelessness, and the power of kindness. She became a symbol of hope for many young people who felt invisible, despite their public lives. Charles and Alia valued quiet moments the most. They often spent evenings together, cooking simple meals, watching old movies, or just talking about their dreams. These moments helped them heal wounds that words couldn't reach. Nana remained a strong presence in Alia's life. She was proud to see her granddaughter growing into a confident young woman. Nana's stories about Rachel kept the memory of Alia's mother alive and helped both Charles and Alia feel connected to the past. One winter evening, Charles and Alia sat by the fireplace in his house. Snow fell softly outside, covering the city in white. Charles looked at Alia and said, "You have changed my life more than you know." Alia smiled, feeling warmth not just from the fire but from deep inside her heart. "Saved me too." She replied, their journey had not been easy. It had taken courage, forgiveness, and a willingness to face the past. But in the end, it was worth every step. Years later, Alia graduated as a nurse. She stood proudly wearing her cap and gown. With Charles and Nana cheering from the front row, it was a day filled with joy and tears. Charles felt a deep pride, knowing that his daughter was not just successful but kind, strong, and full of hope. After the ceremony, Alia announced her plan to open a free clinic in her old neighborhood. Charles promised to help fund it and support the community in every way he could. Their story became more than just about a billionaire and a poor girl. It became about love, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. It showed how kindness can change lives, how people can grow, and how family can be found in the most unexpected ways. Charles and Alia's bond remained unbreakable. They celebrated birthdays together, shared holidays, and built new memories. Their past didn't disappear, but it became a part of their strength in the end. They learned that life was not about the mistakes they made, but about the choices they made afterward. They chose to love, to forgive, and to build a future together. And that future was bright.